the level at which you can ask questions at SEC Media Days is one thing. But let's say you are able to sit down with Brent Venables, players of your choice, maybe even other coaches around the SEC and other players, and you could have an actual sit down with them, discussion, you're at lunch, nothing gets recorded, you get to ask them whatever you want, no holds barred, it's a real conversation. What would you ask Brent Venables and anybody else you'd like to talk to?
Interesting question. I mean, I think I would just, what are your realistic expectations for this year? You know, what's a good season for Oklahoma this year? Because I think there's a lot of, um, when you think about Oklahoma as a whole, just historically, right? Like 8-4 is not a good season. Like, heck, this is 8-4s are the reason that Gary Gibbs got fired, right? And I know this is years and years and years ago, right? Like we're dating ourselves here. This is over 30 years ago. But things haven't changed, right? And so I think I wonder two things. Now, what's a good season? Will the fan base? I think probably so, right? But would the fan base be happy with an 8-4 season? I mean, or would it be one of those things where, okay, 8-4 is okay, but we need um, a double digit win season the following year. So I think just um, realistic expectations. I think would be one. Um, Maybe is the job harder than you thought it would be, or is it easier, or is it about what you expected? Specifically with him being a first time head coach. Interesting to see um, what that looks like for him. So, yeah, I think those are some of the questions that I would ask. I mean, I think when you players would probably handle that question a little bit differently than Venables would, right? I mean, players are always optimistic, especially early on in the year. They're going to say that we've got a chance to compete for a championship, for a conference championship, and make the playoffs. But yeah, what that realistic expectation, and what do you consider a good season?
Yeah, because I often think of that in terms of you either get the answer that we're playing for championships, we play for the best, we play to be the best, or that's a little bit too far down the road. Maybe we got to focus on the next day, the next practice, the next rep, uh, that sort of conclusion. But yeah, I think on one hand, some college football fans, many college football fans, have the mentality or the mindset or look at this as though the Nick Sabans, Urban Meyers, those kind of level guys are the ultimate winners, competitors, will do anything to win. They're obsessed with it. And that for the guy that has a 50 or 60 winning percentage, that because they didn't achieve at that level, that they're not as strong a competitors. And I don't necessarily think that's always the case. I just think circumstances and skill set and ability to lead and all these things, but in terms of being a competitor and wanting to win just as badly as anybody, I'm not going to pin that on anyone that the coach at Purdue or the coach at Kansas or the coach at Stanford or pick your school isn't as competitive as anybody else. I just don't know if they have the wherewithal themselves or have been surrounded by the resources to get it done. So to have that much competitive nature, to want to be the best, to desire to be the best, but to know logically that you don't have that opportunity. You're at South Carolina this season, you're at Mississippi State, you're at Arkansas. Like, how do you balance that mentality showing up at the football facility every day and you have just as much drive to win as Nick Saban, let's say, but you know realistically that you don't have that opportunity?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. No, absolutely. And I think one of the things that I caught, that I knew this, and I think there's been a little bit of a misleading narrative at times that's basically said, "Oh, Venables was handed the keys to the Porsche." Well, that's not necessarily the case. Like he'd mentioned that within his first, I think he said within his first 15 months that they lost, and this is just a mind-boggling number. They had lost 75 scholarship players in 15 months. So, I mean, while not anywhere near a full rebuild, right? But when you think of a roster turnover to that nature, of that nature, then that kind of speaks volumes to the challenge that Brent had coming in here. And so I think there's a couple of things that I think about when you look at maybe this year and even beyond, for for Brent. I know he just recently got a contract extension, which is fantastic. Now I wonder what will the fan base again consider consider good, right? I mean, I think Oklahoma made a huge leap from where they were, 2 years ago. Just barely making the bowl game and finishing 6-7, 6-6 during the regular season. But then last year, obviously a big step up, 10-3 overall, 10-2 in the regular season, with just the two close losses that they had to Oklahoma State and Kansas. And so that's one thing. Um, Bowl win. I mean, I think it would be good for him to get a bowl win. I don't know that in the grand scheme of things, I don't know if that really matters all that much anymore. Specifically if it's not a college football playoff bowl win, but still, if they fire off, and I think I've said this, when we talk, I think 8-4 is kind of the dividing line. I think 8-4 is a good solid season. 9-3, I think, is a great season for Oklahoma this year, right? Because we talked about those games. If you're 9-3, you've probably beaten. If you go 9-3, you've probably either beaten Alabama at home, at LSU, at Ole Miss, probably one of those three games, at Auburn, one of those three or four games. So at least, but I think if it's a 7-5 or 6-6 thing, then I think there's going to be some questions whether or not is Oklahoma really ready to be in the SEC. Is Venables the guy that's going to be able to move them, um, you know, in that category? And I think it doesn't really get talked about a lot when you kind of think about this season, but Oklahoma, not only is there those are there those questions on the offense and defensive line, Oklahoma's ushering in two new coordinators, right? Zach Alley coming in from Jacksonville State, which is, I don't know if you've heard him talk or listened to him at all, Mark. Like he is Brent Venables 2.0. Like he is just Venables mentored him, when he's at Clemson, did a really good job at Jacksonville State last year. And so I think for what Venables has done over the last couple of years, he's had so much like input on the defense, and whether or not anyone wants to admit this, he's been calling plays the last 2 years. But I think he's going away from that. He's letting him. Um, so there's a lot of familiarity. It's not like they're installing a brand new defense for one. And then on the offensive side of the ball, Seth Luttrell taking over for Jeff Lebby as an offensive coordinator. Very similar, right? I mean, obviously Venables didn't have his nose into the offensive side of the ball as much as he did on the defensive side, but Seth Luttrell's very similar in terms of what they're going to run versus what Lebby ran. I mean, I don't think you're going to see as much. They probably won't go as fast. They might even huddle a little bit, which is interesting. Seth Luttrell will slow it down just a bit more than and probably have a little bit more dedication to the run game at times. That kind of so. I think the hope and I think the thought prevailing is that Levy and Bill Bedenbaugh were a little bit. I don't know that I would say at odds, but wasn't really um, wasn't really the offense that Bill Bedenbaugh loved, and so Seth Luttrell and Bedenbaugh are very much attached at the hip, and so I think there's a little bit more with that. But yeah, there's a lot of with those two things, ushering in a new quarterback going into the SEC. There's a lot of new things, a lot of new challenges to navigate. But yeah, that I still like I said that 8-4 um, line I think will be interesting because Oklahoma's done a very good job recruiting here in 2025. But you know, from a recruiting perspective, I think you're going to want to have a solid season in year one to get those guys to think, okay, maybe they're not quite there yet at Alabama's level, at Georgia's level, maybe even like LSU historically, those types of teams. But they had a solid year one, and that's a good building block moving forward.
Before you brought it up, I was going to make the same statement about 8-4 and 9-3, and you gave it a little bit more depth with the analysis of the schedule. I was just going by just feel that
Yeah.
9-3 just feels like, from the reasonable fan, that was progress. That was an accomplishment. We played in a really tough league and we came through it at 9-3, which would be 5-3 in the SEC, you would think.
Yeah.
Uh, Sparing some monumental upset, of course, but 5-3 in the SEC versus 8-4 is 4-4. And sure, it's not going to be calling for Brent Venables' job by any stretch, but that 9-3, and again, to a certain extent, for people that look into it a little bit deeper, it depends how it looks. Of course, if they go 8-4 and they lose 4 nail biters, then to anyone really wanting to evaluate the performance of the program and the progress made, then that should be taken into consideration, and then there could possibly be a quote unquote weak 9-3 if they just get completely exposed 3 times. Is not going to look good. So save those two ends of the spectrum situations. I do believe that 8-4 is acceptable. 9-3 would be an accomplishment.
Oh, absolutely. Well, and as there's no point of comparison for this, but if you go 9-3 in the SEC, very likely you're a playoff team, right? But to your point, if the 3 losses are by 17 to 24 points or more each, then maybe the narrative is a little bit different. But just thinking about it, 9-3 probably get you to the playoff in the SEC, particularly thinking about what Oklahoma's schedule does look like this year. So, and not to say that 7-5 is a bad, like an awful year. Let's not. I mean, in the SEC year one, I don't know that that's necessarily considered an awful year, but I mean, it's probably if just using your logic, which I agree with, 7-5 probably means 3-5 in the SEC. Um, right? Even though some of these non-conference games aren't necessarily pushovers, like two of them are, Temple and Maine, right? But then Houston and Tulane isn't necessarily like a gimme, right? Um, but I think most people think that if Oklahoma drops one of these non-conference games, then um, it's not going to be pretty the rest of the way. But yeah, and I think it means so much going forward. Obviously, 8-4, 7-5 doesn't really challenge for an SEC title. It doesn't challenge for a playoff spot, but it just puts you in position, and you have a better grasp and understanding what the life in the SEC actually looks like. And so, and don't get me wrong, even if Oklahoma throws out a 6-6, 5-7 season, I don't think anyone's necessarily calling for Brent's head. Now, I will say if that were to happen, then I think the confidence would be waning just a bit, and what he would be able to do. But yeah, I think that from a momentum perspective, you'd love to be in that 8-4, 9-3 range.